You decided to stop eating sugar. You hold on for 2 days, 3 days, a week. Then something happens. Fatigue, stress, boredom, just a Friday evening. And you eat something sweet, then more. And the next morning, that familiar feeling of failure and the habitual thought, no willpower. But here's what I want to say as a nutritionist. This isn't about willpower. It's about biochemistry. Today I'll explain exactly what happens with blood sugar and insulin in your body, why the craving for sweets is a physiological signal, not a moral flaw, and what actually helps reduce it. Let me start with an experience that many people recognize. In the morning, you eat more or less normally. By lunch, harder, especially if you didn't manage to eat on time. But the hardest part is the second half of the day. 3 in the afternoon, 4, work, fatigue, and suddenly you want something sweet very, very badly. A chocolate bar or a cookie, something from the vending machine. Not because you're hungry, not really. The craving just hits like a wave and it's impossible to think of anything else. Or another version, in the evening after dinner. You ate a perfectly normal meal, and 30 minutes later, you're drawn to the fridge for something sweet. Dessert, chocolate, yogurt with sugar, anything with that specific taste. Or this completely typical scenario. You promised yourself no sweets. Day 1, fine. Day 2, holding on. On day 3, someone brings a cake to the office. You take a slice, then another. Then you think, already broke it anyway, and eat more. That's the so-called all or nothing effect, and it's biochemical too. What do all these stories have in common? Not a lack of discipline. The fact that sugar cravings are a signal from the body, not from character. When the body demands something sweet, it's actually signaling something specific. Low blood sugar, a serotonin shortage, chronic stress, chromium deficiency. Fighting this signal with willpower is like trying to ignore a fire alarm. Better to understand what it's saying. There's another moment that's important and rarely talked about. Sugar cravings aren't always really about sugar. Often it's a request for quick energy, for neurotransmitters, for the feeling of fullness and comfort. Sweet is the fastest way to get all of this at once. That's why it works so reliably and why it's so hard to resist. Here's an experiment you can try yourself. The next time a strong craving for something sweet hits, wait 10 minutes, drink a glass of water, eat a few nuts or a piece of cheese. In a significant proportion of cases, the craving will diminish or disappear. This happens not because you displaced the desire, but because the craving arose against a background of a slight blood sugar drop, and protein and fat stabilized it without an insulin spike. That's exactly what needs to happen systemically. And one more aspect I observe constantly. People who say, I can't live without sweets, these are not weak people. On the contrary, they are often very disciplined in many other areas. But in this specific area, physiology is working against them. Understanding this physiology is the first step toward real change. Not guilt, not shame, but knowledge of what is happening and why. Now, the mechanism. I'll explain as a nutritionist, precisely and systematically, without oversimplifications. I'll start with the most important concept, the blood sugar roller coaster, or glycemic pendulum. This is what happens to blood glucose levels throughout the day for most modern people. You eat something with fast carbohydrates, white bread, sweet coffee, cereal, juice, pastry. Glucose from food quickly absorbs into the blood. Blood sugar rises sharply. The pancreas releases insulin, the hormone that opens doors into cells for glucose. With a sharp sugar rise, the insulin surge is also sharp, often excessive. Insulin works fast. Glucose levels fall, sometimes below the starting point. The brain gets a signal, low fuel, and immediately demands fast carbs. The cycle closes. This is exactly the moment, in the dip after the sugar peak, when cravings are most acute. This isn't a desire, it's a physiological brain need for fuel, and that's why willpower is nearly powerless here. You're fighting an instinct for survival. There's a good way to track the roller coaster without testing. If fatigue, reduced focus, and an acute desire for something sweet appear 90 to 120 minutes after eating, that's a postprandial hypoglycemic crash. Another sign? Not wanting breakfast in the morning, but at 11 to 12, there's an acute craving specifically for something fast. Third sign? After a filling lunch, drowsiness and desire for sweets. All of these are versions of the same glycemic pendulum. First mechanism: insulin resistance and impaired cellular sensitivity. With chronically high consumption of sugar and fast carbs, cells gradually lose sensitivity to insulin. Insulin knocks on the door. The cell responds more and more weakly. The pancreas responds by producing more insulin to achieve the same effect. High insulin stimulates fat accumulation and blocks its breakdown. Simultaneously, glucose doesn't enter cells in adequate amounts, despite its presence in the blood. Cells starve at high blood sugar. They demand glucose again. Sugar cravings intensify. A closed circle. Sweet to insulin, spike fight to insulin resistance to sugar cravings. Breaking this with willpower alone is impossible. You need to work on cellular insulin sensitivity. A practical sign of insulin resistance that you can notice yourself. Weight gain predominantly in the abdominal area while overall weight is relatively normal. Visceral fat tissue is metabolically active. It produces pro-inflammatory cytokines that further reduce insulin sensitivity. This is yet another loop within the larger loop. That's why a reduction in this type of fat is a signal that insulin sensitivity is improving. Second mechanism, the role of chromium in insulin signaling. Here's the key point for understanding chromium's role. Chromium is a trace element that forms part of a biologically active molecule called chromogylin. Chromogylin is a protein that literally amplifies the insulin signal inside the cell. It activates tyrosine kinase, the enzyme that launches the cascade of reactions opening glucose transporters on the cell surface. Simply put, insulin is the key. Chromium is what makes the lock more sensitive. With chromium deficiency, the insulin signal is weaker. Cells respond to insulin more poorly. More insulin is needed for the same effect. More blood sugar fluctuations. Sharper craving for fast carbs. Chromium is actively consumed with every intake of sugar and refined carbohydrates. The more sweets a person eats, the faster their chromium stores are depleted. Less chromium, weaker insulin signal, stronger craving for sweets. A vicious cycle at the nutrient level. Third mechanism. Dopamine and sugar addiction. This isn't a metaphor, it's neuroscience. When eating something sweet, the brain's reward system activates. Dopaminergic neurons in the nucleus accumbens release dopamine. This creates the feeling of pleasure and motivates repeating the behavior. With chronic sugar consumption, dopamine receptors reduce their sensitivity. More sugar is needed for the same effect. This is literally the same dynamic as with nicotine or alcohol addiction, on a smaller scale but through the same neural principles. That's why just stopping sugar is so difficult. When you suddenly cut it, dopamine receptors temporarily lack their usual stimulation. Discomfort, irritability, low mood occur. This isn't weakness of character, it's neural recalibration that takes time. This is why gradual reduction is significantly more effective than abrupt cessation. With a slow decrease in dose, the neural system has time to adapt. Dopamine receptors slowly restore their sensitivity. The need for stimulation decreases. After a few weeks, the person notices that the usual amount of sweets produces a smaller effect, and the need for it diminishes. This is precisely the real goal of working with sweets, not fighting the desire by force, but its gradual and natural fading. Fourth mechanism, serotonin, carbohydrates, and mood. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter regulating mood, anxiety, well-being. Its synthesis depends on tryptophan, an amino acid that enters the brain most effectively against the background of an insulin response, meaning carbohydrates, through insulin, effectively open the path for tryptophan into the brain, and thereby stimulate serotonin production. This explains why sugar cravings sharply intensify under stress, anxiety, autumn blues, and at the end of a hard-working day. The body literally uses sweets as a fast way to boost serotonin. This isn't weakness, it's biochemical self-help. The problem is that this method works very briefly and triggers the blood sugar roller coaster, which ultimately worsens both mood and energy. There's a more sustainable way to raise serotonin. Physical activity, even 20 minutes of walking, significantly raises serotonin levels and maintains them for several hours. Sunlight activates serotonin synthesis, which is exactly why cravings for sweets are especially strong on gray autumn and winter days. Adequate sleep is necessary for restoring serotonin receptors. Understanding these mechanisms opens up other tools for managing cravings without sugar. Fifth mechanism, cortisol and stress-driven cravings. Under stress, cortisol raises blood glucose levels. The body is preparing for action. But if no physical action follows, which is the case with work stress, glucose falls again, and an acute craving for sweets and fatty foods appears. The brain wants to replenish spent resources. That's exactly why stress eating is not a psychological weakness. It's a neuroendocrine mechanism. Cortisol also reduces cellular sensitivity to insulin and depletes chromium stores. Like all stress hormones, it requires more resources. The more chronically elevated the stress, the more acute the craving for sweets, the worse the insulin signal works, the faster chromium is consumed. This explains a very specific life pattern. On vacation, the craving for sweets decreases, not because diet or willpower changed, but because cortisol dropped, and with it, the neuroendocrine mechanism that was using sweets to compensate for the stress-induced glucose expenditure weakened its demand. That's precisely why stress management is not a soft suggestion, but a direct tool for changing cravings. Sixth mechanism, Disruption of circadian rhythm and nighttime cravings. Cellular insulin sensitivity follows a circadian rhythm. In the morning, it's higher. In the evening, it's lower. This means the same product causes a greater insulin response in the evening than in the morning. That's exactly why evening cravings for sweets are especially dangerous from the perspective of the blood sugar roller coaster. In the evening, sugar rises faster and falls faster. Chronic sleep deprivation disrupts this rhythm and additionally reduces insulin sensitivity. Just one night of inadequate sleep increases sweet consumption the following day. This has been documented in research. The mechanism? Poor sleep raises ghrelin, hunger, lowers leptin, satiety, raises cortisol, and reduces insulin sensitivity. Now the mistakes. The most typical strategies for fighting sweets that don't work or work in reverse. Mistake 1. Relying only on willpower. This is the most widespread and most destructive strategy. Willpower is a limited resource that depletes throughout the day. That's exactly why breakdowns most often happen in the evening or after a hard day, not in the morning in a good mood. Fighting a biochemical signal about serotonin shortage or low blood sugar with willpower is like trying to ignore thirst. It doesn't work for long. The right strategy is not to fight the craving, but to eliminate its cause. Mistake 2. Cutting all carbohydrates suddenly. Just remove all fast carbs and everything will pass. Sounds reasonable, but in practice it triggers several problems simultaneously. Abrupt carb reduction lowers serotonin levels. Mood falls, irritability rises. The dopamine system, habituated to sweets, gets no stimulation. Discomfort grows. After a few days or weeks, a relapse, usually stronger than if the person had simply eaten moderately. The right strategy is gradual substitution, not abrupt elimination. Mistake 3. Skipping meals. If I don't have breakfast, I'll eat less at lunch. This doesn't work. When meals are skipped, blood sugar falls, cortisol rises, and by the next meal, the craving for fast carbs is especially acute. Skipping breakfast or lunch reliably increases the probability of evening overeating, including sweets. Regular meals stabilize blood sugar levels and reduce the sharpness of cravings. Mistake 4. Eating diet sweet substitutes. Sweeteners don't raise blood glucose, that's true, but they activate the dopamine reward system the same way as regular sugar, or even more intensely. Some are much sweeter than sugar. This sustains the neural craving pattern for sweet taste. Reduction in need doesn't happen. The person continues to be hooked on sweetness, just without the calories. There is also data suggesting that certain sweeteners disrupt the gut microbiome and can paradoxically worsen glycemic control. The only way to reduce the neural craving for sweet taste is to gradually decrease the overall sweetness of the diet. Not replacing one sweet taste with another, but literally retraining the taste receptors and dopamine system. After a few weeks of reducing sweetness, the person starts to notice the natural sweetness of vegetables, berries, certain grains, something they couldn't feel before because of recalibrated receptors. Mistake 5. Ignoring protein and fat at every meal. This is one of the most practical mistakes. When people want to reduce sugar cravings, they often focus on what to remove, but it's more important what to add. Protein significantly slows carbohydrate absorption, reduces the glycemic response, and provides prolonged satiety. Fat also slows stomach emptying and smooths the subsequent blood sugar spike. A meal without sufficient protein and fat is practically a guarantee of hunger and sugar cravings returning within 2 to 3 hours. Mistake 6. Not accounting for chromium deficiency. Most people with chronic sugar cravings have never checked their chromium levels and have never thought about it in the context of their situation. Yet chromium is actively depleted by consuming refined carbohydrates, under stress, and during physical activity. Modern diets dominated by processed foods contain almost no chromium. Chromium deficiency directly reduces cellular sensitivity to insulin and intensifies carbohydrate cravings. Correcting this deficiency is one of the most underappreciated practical steps. Now, what actually works? The strategy for reducing sugar cravings is not prohibition and not fighting yourself. It's changing the biochemical conditions that make cravings arise. First, stabilize blood sugar through meal structure. 3 to 4 meals daily without long gaps. Every meal, protein plus fiber plus a little healthy fat. This combination is exactly what creates a slow, smooth rise in blood sugar without a sharp peak and subsequent crash. Protein at the beginning of a meal, before carbohydrates, reduces the postprandial glycemic response by approximately 20 to 30%. This isn't a diet, it's the architecture of eating. In practice, start every meal with an egg, meat, fish, cottage cheese, or nuts, and only then carbohydrates. This order order alone radically reduces the insulin spike from the very same food. One more practical detail. Adding 2 to 3 tablespoons of vinegar to food with a high glycemic index reduces the postprandial blood sugar spike by 20 to 30%. The mechanism: acetic acid slows stomach emptying and suppresses the activity of amylase, the enzyme that breaks down starch. This is a small but quite real and practical tool for managing the glycemic roller coaster. Second, replace fast carbohydrates with slow ones. Refined carbohydrates, white bread, sugar, juice, white rice, baked goods, cause a sharp glucose spike and an equally sharp crash. Slow ones, whole grains, legumes, most vegetables, raise blood sugar slowly and smoothly. The replacement doesn't have to be complete or immediate. Gradual substitution, adding more fiber, reducing the proportion of refined products, already produces a noticeable effect on cravings. Third, normalize sleep. If a person is chronically sleep deprived, any work with sweets delivers half the results. Precisely because poor sleep, through cortisol, ghrelin, and insulin insensitivity, creates biochemical conditions for cravings. 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep is a direct tool for reducing daytime carbohydrate cravings. This isn't hyperbole, it's physiology. Fourth, work on stress as a glycemic task. Chronic stress, through cortisol, creates a constant demand for quick fuel. Lower cortisol, lower biochemical demand for sweets. Any stress reduction practice, physical activity, breathing techniques, walks, pauses without information overload, is direct work with sugar cravings, not just self-care in general. Fifth, ensure adequate chromium intake. Chromium is one of the key trace elements in glycemic regulation. When it's deficient, the insulin signal works less effectively. Cells are less responsive. This directly intensifies cravings for fast carbohydrates. Food sources of chromium: broccoli, beef, oysters, chicken breast, eggs. The problem: modern processed foods contain almost no chromium. With chronic sugar cravings, especially in people with high stress levels and refined diets, additional supplementation is worth considering. On the specific product in the next section. Sixth, add regular physical activity. Muscle work is one of the most effective ways to improve cellular insulin sensitivity, independent of diet. During physical activity, muscles can absorb glucose directly, without insulin, through the GLUT4 mechanism. This reduces the load on the insulin system and over time increases its sensitivity. 30 to 40 minutes of moderate activity 5 times a week, and the cellular response to insulin improves within a few weeks. Sugar cravings noticeably decrease. An important detail: strength training produces a more pronounced and lasting effect on insulin sensitivity than cardio. During strength work, muscles accumulate glycogen, and for a long time increase their ability to absorb glucose without insulin. That's exactly why regular strength training is especially beneficial for people with strong sugar cravings. Not for burning calories, but for improving glucose metabolism. Seventh, don't fight the desire itself, but work on its cause. This is perhaps the most important principle. Sugar craving is a symptom. Eliminating a symptom by willpower is ineffective. Eliminating the cause, stabilizing blood sugar, correcting deficiencies, reducing stress, normalizing sleep, is the work that actually changes the situation. And the longer a person works on the cause, the smaller the craving itself becomes, because the biochemical conditions for it disappear. Now specifically, about chromium picolinate and why it's relevant for sugar cravings. I'll start with the most important understanding. Chromium is the only trace element for which a direct connection to insulin signaling is established. Without sufficient chromium, insulin works significantly less effectively, not because there's too little of it, but because the cellular response to it is weakened. Mechanism: chromium enters chromogylin, a special protein amplifier of the insulin signal. When insulin binds to the receptor on the cell surface, chromogylin activates and launches the intracellular cascade that opens glucose transporters. Without sufficient chromogylin, this cascade runs slowly and incompletely. Glucose doesn't enter the cell as quickly as it should. The cell stays in a deficit state and sends a signal demanding fast carbohydrates. Why picolinate specifically? This matters. Chromium in different forms has different bioavailability. Chromium picolinate is one of the most bioavailable forms. Picolinic acid forms a chelate complex with the chromium ion, which absorbs in the intestine far better than inorganic forms. The bioavailability of chromium picolinate is roughly 10 times higher than chromium chloride. That's exactly why clinical studies on chromium's effect on glycemic control most commonly use this specific form. What clinical studies show? Several meta-analyses confirm that chromium picolinate supplementation in people with impaired glucose tolerance reduces fasting glucose, lowers insulin levels, and improves the insulin resistance index. In people with chronic carbohydrate cravings, it reduces subjective craving intensity intensity and actual carbohydrate consumption. The effect is most pronounced in people with baseline chromium deficiency and high insulin resistance. One of the most frequently cited studies, in people with atypical depression and pronounced carbohydrate cravings, taking chromium picolinate for 8 weeks significantly reduced carbohydrate cravings compared to placebo. Interestingly, in the chromium group, mood also improved, likely through improved glycemic control and its effect on serotonin synthesis. This confirms the connection between chromium, insulin, carbohydrate metabolism, and neurotransmitters. Another study showed that chromium picolinate reduces the frequency of binge eating episodes and so-called carbohydrate binges in people with compulsive eating behavior. This is consistent with the dopamine mechanism. Normalization of glycemic control reduces the neural demand for dopamine reward from sweets. Now about the specific product. Chromium picolinate 250 micrograms per capsule, 60 capsules. Composition. Active ingredient at the indicated dosage. Excipients. Microcrystalline cellulose, gelatin capsule. Clean formula without unnecessary additives. 250 micrograms is 500% of the recommended daily intake of chromium. This may seem like a lot, but it's important to understand. Daily intake norms are set to prevent deficiency in a healthy person. With chronic sugar cravings, high consumption of refined carbohydrates, and chronic stress, the need for chromium is significantly higher. At the same time, chromium is toxic only at doses hundreds of times higher than therapeutic. 250 micrograms per day is within the safe range confirmed by years of clinical data. How to take it? With food, in the first half of the day. This is optimal in terms of coinciding with peak insulin activity. Take regularly. The cumulative effect matters. The first changes, reduced intensity of sugar cravings, especially after meals, many people notice within 2 to 4 weeks. An important clarification, chromium picolinate doesn't eliminate sugar cravings on its own if the diet remains based on refined carbohydrates. It works as one element of a system, improves insulin signaling, which reduces craving intensity, provided the diet is moving toward blood sugar stabilization. It's a tool that supports change, not a substitute for change itself. Who is this most relevant for? People with chronic sugar cravings, especially in the second half of the day and in the evening. Those who notice that cravings intensify under stress and with poor sleep. People with signs of impaired glycemic control, fatigue after meals, sharp fluctuations in energy throughout the day, weight gain predominantly in the abdominal area, and those whose diet has historically been high in refined carbohydrates. They are most likely to have a pronounced chromium deficiency. The link to chromium picolinate 250 micrograms, 60 capsules for 2 months is in the description of this video.
Let's summarize and say what is often left unsaid. If you can't stop eating sugar, this isn't about not trying hard enough. It's about your biochemistry creating conditions where the craving is inevitable. Blood sugar roller coaster, insulin resistance, chromium deficiency, chronic stress, sleep deprivation, serotonin hunger. These are all real physiological causes, not moral ones. Understanding this changes not only the approach, it changes the relationship with yourself. Instead of the familiar, "I'm weak," I have a specific physiological situation that can and should be worked with. 3 concrete steps worth taking right now. Start every meal with protein, before any carbohydrates. Normalize sleep. Even 1 to 2 extra hours of quality sleep reduces sugar cravings. And consider chromium picolinate as support for insulin signaling, link in the description. Sugar cravings reliably diminish not when you start controlling yourself harder, they diminish when your body no longer needs them. That's the gradual state worth consistently working toward. And one last thing, but an important one. If someone close to you says, "Just stop eating sugar," now you know what to say in response. Not an excuse and not self-criticism. An explanation. This is biochemistry that yields to change methodically, gradually, and without constant struggle with yourself.